Ko Jin Hong was one of the best experts on ancient writings in Daemun. His 7-year-old son Jin Young went to the library every day, where his father dealt with smelly books. The father spent whole days sitting at the table with a book in his hands, not even noticing how sadly his child was watching the work. He didn't like his job. Playing with his father was something he couldn't even dream of. And when in the evenings there was time to sit together, drinking alcohol, the father took off his glasses in which he always worked and talked about his mother, looking absent-mindedly at his son. His father smiled at his thoughts as he looked at him and stroked his head. The boy liked it, although it smelled of alcohol. Clutching his son in his arms, the father once asked Jin Young, "Do you miss your mother?" The child, breaking away from the bear hugs, smiled cheerfully and carelessly replied, "I'm fine because I have a father." And hiding his face on his father's chest, he muttered, "So many guys in the neighborhood, like Wang Ho or Ho Jin, lost their own in the war. I'm glad to be with you." The father, chuckling, gently scolded him, "That's a brat." There was a quiet giggle in response. My father said thank you in a barely audible voice. Jin Young was sitting on the porch with a book when he heard the familiar shouts from the main gate. "Hey, is there anyone?" He hurriedly walked to the door and shouted back, "Yes, I'm coming out." Cautiously opening the door, he asked, "Who is there?" And at the same moment, Uncle Chong shouted enthusiastically. Uncle John laughed and waved his hands affably and asked Jin Young, "Are you doing well?" Noticing the book in his hands, the old man smiled guiltily and grabbed the edge of his hat and asked, "So, have you read the book?" Jin Young, clutching the book to his chest, replied, "Yes." "Is everything all right at home? Is Auntie all right?" The old man thoughtfully put his mustache on his fingers and muttered, "If such a 7-year-old boy asks such a thing, what should I answer?" With all his childlike spontaneity and seriousness, Jin Young asked, "Didn't they get married at the age of 7 in the old days?" Smiling excitedly, Uncle Chong hugged the child with one hand and stroked his hair. "That's a funny guy. If only our dream would be like you." Jin Young coughed and said, "Uncle, it's hard for me to breathe." After pouring the liquid into a bowl, Jin Hong handed it to his friend. "Here, take it." After drinking a bowl, Jin Hong spoke up, "So you want me to decipher the ancient writings on the gold plates?" Chan began to fervently persuade his friend just like that. "In fact, among all the scientists there is no one more talented than you. Moreover, this is a great opportunity, as His Excellency is very interested." Jin Hong said thoughtfully, "I have not yet completed the research of relics, which I have been doing for 10 years. His interlocutor loudly objected, "My friend has only 3 gold plates. With your abilities, you can solve this case in a few days." Jin Hong was silent, guiltily bowing his head. Meanwhile, Jung continued to push, "I know your pride, but think about Jin Young's future." And, accusingly raising his index finger, Chan continued his tirade. "Studying antiquities is important, but how many decades have you wasted? I know that you have run out of money. There are fewer family members, so there are debts everywhere. Think about your son's future. Forget about your relics for a while, and study the golden plates. Understood?" After a pause, Jin Hong still replied, "Okay, I get it." The answer to him was a satisfied, "Excellent solution, my friend." Jin Young, who was listening to the conversation under the door, looked at his father and family friend in confusion. The father, dressed in traveling clothes, gave the last instructions. "I don't know how long it will take, but I don't think it will take long. Listen to the babysitter." Excitedly throwing his fists up, Oji said, "Don't worry." The father smiled and replied, "Well, I'll be back soon." Sitting on the porch of the house, Jin Young was waiting for his father, not paying attention at all to the sunset of unprecedented beauty. Sighing, he looked at the side of the road along which his father had left. He said to himself, "Phew, and won't come today?" Upset when he entered the house, his gaze caught on the door leading to his father's office. "A thought flashed through my head if I think about it." Quietly opening the door and sticking my head in there, Jin Young said, interestingly on the verge of audibility. After looking around, he walked into the office much more confidently with sweeping baby steps. When he saw a huge bookcase with books, he gasped, "Wow, so many books." Turning around, he carefully looked at the painting in the middle of the room. Looking at it with a twinkle in his eyes, he thought, if I remember correctly, there is. He put the edge of the canvas aside in one fell swoop, opening the stairs leading to his father's vault. Confused, he said to himself under his breath and knew it. Taking a candle, he carefully began to descend, saying, "Well, I'll look around a little. Can I?" He barely opened the door to the vault, a slit the size of an eye, ready to run away in case of anything. After a little hesitation, he opened the door wider and gasped enthusiastically when he saw all the decorations of the vault. Approaching various old figurines, he said, "Incredible. So many strange objects." Turning his head, he saw a glass box, binoculars, a painted wall clock, and there is one from the West too. Gene Young froze when he saw the box in front of his eyes, and muttered, "Father studied it all his life. And what kind of things are there?" Opening the box, he began rummaging through it, and saying to himself, "A strange staff, books with strange inscriptions." And disappointed, he asked, "Emptiness, and that's it?" Bringing the candle closer, he noticed a certain object and said, "There is something else here." Taking the object in his hand, he shouted, "Found it." And then I thought, "What is it?" The octagon answered itself. After examining it better, he said what a terrible face was cut out. After thinking about it, Gene Young decided to leave and muttered, "I'll put everything back in its place." Suddenly, having got stuck on the lid of the box, he looked at the finger that was pricked with pain and said dejectedly, "Damn, scratched." A drop of blood immediately fell on the octagon, made it light up. Before he could bring his finger to his face, Gene Young turned his gaze to the octagon and nervously muttered, "Ah. Ah." After a moment, he screamed heartrendingly. The box began to glow more and more, and finally bluish rays burst out of it directly in the direction of Gene Young. He screamed as the nimble rays began to invade his body. The veins on his face began to swell. The rays continued to enter the little boy's body through his eyes and mouth. His body shot up and began to rock. Then he was abruptly thrown to the floor. He bulged his eyes, but before he could do anything, he lost consciousness. After a while, he opened his eyes with a groan. Gene Young abruptly jumped out of his seat. Remembering the latest events and frantically looking around, he asked himself what happened now. He glanced nervously at the damned octagon and hurriedly closed the box. Walking away, towards the exit, he muttered to himself, "What a horror, we have to leave." After taking a step, he stopped dead in his tracks and heard a voice in his head. You. Then he heard coughing and nasty giggling. Turning his head from side to side, he asked, "What is it?" Gene Young jumped on the spot and rushed to the exit, covering his ears with his hands. Pain shot through his head, and he fell to his knees. Gene Young's eyes bulged with fear when he caught a light touch of clawed fingers on his face. His left hand darkened slightly and made a swing towards his face. Trying to stop the raging hand with his healthy one, he grabbed it. He felt weak and his left hand was printed on his lip and nose, starting to strangle him. Gene Young wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the situation, but only a hoarse cough came out of his mouth. He jerked convulsively when he heard the voice in his head again, "Obey me." The second palm covered his hand on his face, and he convulsively ordered him to come out. Screaming in impotent anger, he jerked, and a blue ball with a shock wave began to form around him, covering almost the entire room. Gene Young was breathing with his mouth wide open, staring at his hands in a daze, beads of sweat dripping all over his face. He hurriedly moved towards the exit of the niche and heard, "You can't leave." In response, he twisted his face and said, "Get out." After taking a couple of steps, he wearily leaned against a brick wall. The body suddenly became heavy as an unaffordable rock. He told himself loudly and clearly to get together. "I can't lose." He opened his mouth as if he remembered one simple truth and whispered spellbound, "Exactly. If I don't lose my mind, I can win." Then, with some unprecedented ease, he went up the stairs. How did it happen? I moved into this human cub and thought that I would immediately take over his body and soul. But I couldn't. Obviously father did it when he sealed me. We'll have to look for another way even if it takes a long time. Lying in bed, Jin Young thought, and suddenly came to the conclusion that he no longer hears the sounds that were in his father's vault. Jin Young asked himself, has he disappeared? In response, he heard a voice in his head, no. What's your name? Hiccuping, he convulsively jumped out of bed and unbelievingly said, what again? In his head, they answered, you are the one who woke me up, Sertana. Say your name. Stupefied with fear, he began to mutter, what for? I don't want to. Drawing attention to the fact that a corner of his room was occupied by a certain black mass in which only two eyes resembling a blue light could be seen, he stammered, I don't want to. I won't tell you. The blue light seemed to squint, and their owner asked mockingly, I don't want to. Don't want to call you. Jin Young was sitting on the porch, drowning in the rays of the sun with a sad face. He turned around in a daze at the cry of the naughty young master. Coming closer and looking at him carefully, she said worriedly, do you have a very pale face? Does it hurt a lot? Taking a deep breath, Jin Young assured the babysitter, nothing special. I'll rest a little and it will pass. The nanny turned away and went about her business, but turned around and still with the same worried face gave instructions, well, today do not read a lot of books, but rest. Jin Young, left alone with himself, muttered to himself, if I tell, then they will consider me crazy. Jin Young twitched when he heard the voice in his head again, I don't want to. He thought dejectedly again. That voice again. Meanwhile, the voice in his head continued to ask, what kind of place is this? The air here is completely different. There are no spirits in this place? Jin Young groaned in resignation, and the voice asked impatiently, hey? I don't want to. Clutching his head, he said angrily in his head, that's it. I don't want my name. And already said out loud, can't you shut up? Having blown up, he screamed, oh you Cherutin. Cherchuan. An angry voice answered him, my name is not Cherutin, but Sertan. The great warrior Micaiah Serutan. Raising his fist belligerently, Jin Young said fiercely, don't be ridiculous. Me. If I don't want to, then you're fucked. Understood? Cherutan. He blinked uncomprehendingly when he heard silence in response. Sitting at the table, he was looking at the food. He was distracted by the voice of the Nani Bon Appetit, young master. Sitting down comfortably at the table, he thanked her thanks for the food, Nani. Rice, fried tofu, pies for the season, shrimp and batter in sauce. All this yummy to him alone. Smiling, he grabbed the chopsticks. In his head there was a thought, he can't be hurt anymore. Gone at last? Immediately he heard a voice in his head, how did you know? Jin Young choked and jerked with burning thoughts, didn't leave? The voice was pressing, I ask, how did you know? Turning his head from side to side, he viciously asked, what? The demon replied, my nickname is Cherutin? A skeptical look, alas, the demon did not notice. But I still explained, I'm asking how you found out about the nickname that I was called in Mackay. Jin Young pursed his lips and muttered from under his nose, well, it's just a mispronunciation. But what is Mackay? The demon asked in surprise, what? And he began to crucify him, well this. Mackay is located between the heavenly world and the human world. In fact, the human world was created by the very last. A zone was needed for the conflict of two worlds. Initially, he wasn't supposed to appear. Jin Young held out what in surprise. So Mackay and the heavenly world created the human world to fight? The demon's voice cheerfully replied, just like that. You're smart, I don't want to. And as if in contrast to everything, the boy asked, but how can I believe Cherutin's words? The demon indignantly said that. I told you I'm not a Cherut. Offended, Jin Young replied, you're infuriating. I don't want to be called either. Jin Young thought for a moment, and suddenly burst out laughing. The demon asked with interest, what's wrong with you? Why are you laughing? Wiping away tears of laughter, he explained to the demon, well, if you write Cherutin in Chinese characters, then some meaning will appear. Shui Wei Tang. The uncomprehending demon asked again, what? Jin Young, shuddering with laughter, said the crying singer, and burst out laughing again. Calming down a little and thinking about it, Jin Young asked, are you offended? The demon raised his voice, I don't want to. But how do you do it? Jin Young frowned and asked, what? The demon said animatedly, how did you know about my ability? I can control the minds of opponents with my voice, make them cry, falling into horror. Closing his eyes and getting comfortable on the bed, he muttered to the demon, I don't know, I'm all asleep. Sit still. Cherudin. The demon indignantly replied, I don't want to. I don't want to. Hey, I don't want a bastard. Funny cute. Curious and quick-witted. Wait a minute. What am I thinking about right now? Stupid mercy for this malicious offspring? Wait. Someday your body will be mine. By any means I will return to Makai. Intently counting, Jin Yong said demons usually live 5,000 years. Cherudin, if you have lived 1,000 years, by human standards from 50 to 10 years, then you are 10 years old, then we are definitely friends. The demon desperately objected. What? It can't be. The Nani finished the skirmish that did not have time to begin, calling Jin Yong young master. Young master. Your father is back. The father, taking off his traveling hat, began the conversation. Nothing special happened while I was away. Jin Young hesitated and muttered something incoherent. And I thought in my head, if I tell about Cherudin, my father will know that I secretly climbed into his vault. Nodding to his thoughts, he confidently said no. Nothing. The father smiled and replied, glad to hear it. You must have studied the writing diligently. Giggling, the son replied yes. His father gently stroked his head and left, saying, your father has an urgent matter, we must hurry. Shyly scratching his head, he nodded and said, ah, yes, I understand. The demon raised his voice, I don't want to. What was it? Why is your father not nice to you at all? Rolling his eyes, Jin Young whispered, shut up. Jin Hong went into the house and went to his office. Standing at the painting that hides the niche, he sighed and confidently, and somehow wearily said, there is no time. Going down to the vault, he hurriedly took out blank canvases of paper and began to say to himself, most likely after working on the slabs in the palace, the emperor will kill me. Before that, I have to write everything down. Whatever happens to me. Imperial Palace. The eunuch respectfully bowed his head and entered the bathhouse and asked, sir, did you call me? The emperor, without turning his head in his direction, replied, come in. Picking up the gold cup, he waited for the girl to fill it, and continued to say, is it true that Ko Jin Hong went home? The eunuch, without looking up from the floor, said, yes, sir. He said that the materials he needed were there. A special permit was issued. Squinting his eyes, the emperor loudly said, what? Then the content of the research. And if it leaks out? The eunuch hastened to appease the gentleman by reminding him that less than 5 days had passed since he began his research. Emboldened, he looked up at the emperor and continued to say how many scientists have abandoned research during this time. Therefore, so far he has not disclosed the contents. Before he could finish, he was interrupted by the furious voice of the emperor. Be prepared about what? Smiling cynically, the emperor closed his eyes and leaned back on the side of the bath. Thoughtfully, he said, when he returns, immediately after the completion of the study, his family and everyone connected with him need to be sorted out.